Well, we all have a little bit of Scots in us, so we all know what Scots can be like, right? And those of us that are involved in clans know what clans can be like. Well, I'm going to call up here to the podium an individual who is the president of the the Professional Association of Clans, the Council of Scottish Clans and Associations. So he must be a person that can deal with a whole lot of difficulty and cantankerous people. That's because he's a good person at heart and a person I've gotten to know and developed a great deal of respect. And so I want to call to the podium for purposes of an introduction, John King Belisai, President of CASCA.
Thank you, John. John is my partner in crime. He's the vice president of CASCA. And we can talk at a later time if you're interested about what CASCA does, but we do represent the clan and family societies, Scottish clan and family societies here in the United States. Our sister society is CASIC in Canada. Does the same thing up there. So I'm glad that Joanne Tuscan, who represents CASIC, is here, and we've been catching up on some issues and concerns we have in common, and we'll continue to do that. The reason I'm up here, however, is by way of introducing my friend and colleague Andrew Morrison, Lord Dunrossil, who's our speaker this evening. This is an honor and a pleasure. Lord Dunrossil is on CASCA's advisory board, so I have the opportunity to work with him fairly frequently and fairly closely. He's the former chairman and now vice chairman, I believe, of the Society of Scottish Armigers, and those are persons who bear coats of arms registered with the Lord Lion. A very interesting area, which I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you about if you'd like to know. He's also a member of the Standing Council of Scottish Chiefs, and he's a cousin of the Morrison chief. So that's his connection to the world of clans in Scotland. It goes deeper than that. Lord Dunrossil is, well, he's a kind of schizophrenic fellow. He spends most of his time here in America. He's from San Antonio, Texas, where he works in the financial services industry, and he spends most of the year there. But he also spends part of the time back home in the Hebrides on his ancestral estates there, usually when it gets too hot in Texas. And I grew up in Texas. That's why I left Texas, and that's probably why he leaves Texas in the summertime. But he has a unique perspective to bring because he has a foot in both worlds. The Scottish American diaspora, of which we're all part of, which he's now very closely acquainted with, very active in Scottish Society affairs in San Antonio, their St. Andrew's Society, their Tartan Day, and other things. But he's also, he's a Scottish peer, and he's part of a chiefly family. And his estates in the Hebrides are historic, and they matter to him, and he and his children spend quite a bit of time there. So he has a foot in that world as well. And that's heritage. That's what we're all talking about. That's what we're here to talk about. So Andrew's grandfather, if I can just allude to this, because it kind of, I think, places him where he is. He's the third Viscount Dunrossil. And I believe that was the last hereditary peerage created in the United Kingdom, one of the last. And his grandfather was quite a fellow, larger-than-life fellow. He was Winston Churchill's wartime rations minister or food minister, I believe, which was a big deal in Britain at the time. Went on to become Speaker of the House of Commons, then went on to be Governor General of Australia. And so that's quite a heritage. And the peerage was created for him at the end of his career. Andrew's father was also a Foreign Service professional in British Foreign Service for quite some time. And he's the third Lord Dunrossil, and his son Callum, who I've had the pleasure of meeting, who is his heir, will be the fourth. So that's their history and their connection. But Andrew's very engaged at the local level in his community in Scottish affairs and brings his heritage to all of what he does. So we thought it would be a great occasion for him to speak to us and share some of his perspectives, both from Scotland and from the United States, about the issues we're here to talk about this weekend. So I'd like to introduce Lord Dunrossil. I'll let him get up there because he's got his hands full.
You want me to raise this? Can I push this up a little bit? Is that better? All right. Obviously, when John was introduced as having to deal with all sorts of cantankerous clansmen and so on, I suppose that means me. So anyway, I'm here and I plan to talk to you this evening. But before doing that, I want to thank everybody because this is a tremendous fun for me. It's a tremendous opportunity to come up here. So I want to thank certainly the St. Andrew's Society of Detroit and the Chicago Scots and all the other organizations who are involved in this. And I've very much enjoyed being involved with COSCA and with John and all sorts of other people like part in COSCA. But also one of the things that I should mention is that I'm also very proud to be an honorary patron of the American Scottish Foundation and to have the opportunity of being associated with Camilla and all the fine work that she does. I do none of the work, but I'm just very proud to be associated with it. I love to all of these organizations that come together and that many of them are represented in this conference. I love especially the fact that you can all talk together and you can work together and put all your fine minds together and produce good results because of it. Way too many volunteer organizations live in their own little silos and don't talk to each other. So this is the exception, not the rule. You should be extremely proud of what you've accomplished with this Scottish North American Leadership Council. So what I really want to do now is to just sort of throw up a few little provocative comments about things that I think you're going to be talking about in a more learned fashion over the next day and a half. And I really, I'm not an expert in any of these things, so I thought I'd just float them out there, and then you can either ask me some questions when I've finished, or much more sensibly, you can ask the actual experts who'll be talking tomorrow. So the idea of this conference, as I understood it, was to look at the issue of identity, to look at who we are within the diaspora. By the way, the Donald McLaren of McLaren, who is the current convener of the Standing Council of Scottish Chiefs, came out as a guest of the St. Andrew's Society of Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, was it, when he took over, and the theme of his remarks was that he hated the word diaspora. But frankly, there isn't another word for it, so we're just going to keep calling it the diaspora anyway. Sorry, Donald. So the words at the top of this Is anyone familiar with this? Probably some of the genealogists might know this, but Ko Lesh U is Gaelic for really, who do you belong to? Where do you come from? And it covers all sorts of issues to do with genealogy. It covers, are you a member of a clan? If so, what clan? A big issue for members of the diaspora, people of Scottish descent, is trying to identify who they are back in Scotland. Who's their gang? Which gang are they members of? And if you're lucky, it's not a Forbes. So the problem of identity, and what I want to do is sort of mention some of the issues to do with this, and particularly through the lens, since nobody can make sense of things that are general. You have to have the particular. So the particular that I'm going to try to use as an example to help us think about these is the case of my own clan, Clan Morrison. And we're a somewhat odd case. That doesn't mean that we're all odd people. It just means that we're an odd case. Okay. So who are we, and who are Clan Morrison, and what are we? And that's way too small lettering, and I can't possibly read it from over there. So there are different ways of looking at that. There's the evidence. You could try to answer who they are. If you think you're a Morrison, you try to answer that by maybe looking at a clan map. Again, the convener of the Standing Council of Chiefs wants there to be a new clan map, which of course is a great way of starting all sorts of wars all over again. But we'll talk about the evidence of clan maps briefly. Can you see, oh, well, the Morrisons were here, or, the McFarlanes were over there, or the Campbells were everywhere. Then there's the evidence of DNA. We talk about that. And then there's the evidence of the phone book, which is really, that's serious science we're talking about. And then there's the evidence of tradition, which is in my mind, a much undervalued element in this that I think should be reassessed and should be given more credence than it is. Scientists don't like tradition. And finally, we're going to throw up some, what was that, Mr. Scientist? Okay. Former professor of computer science, Professor Deary. Okay. And then we're going to throw up some tentative conclusions with which you may all feel free to disagree. So here's a clan map. And this was used in some publication about Clan Morrison by people who were convening tents in Highland Games around the country. And the funny thing about this is it says Morrison in some places in there, but this is a little bit like President Trump writing in where the hurricane was going to go and hit Alabama. Because actually, if you look at it carefully, it's handwritten where they've put Morrison. So you probably can't see it from here, but someone's written in, Morrison up here and Morrison over there, sort of Morrison in different places, Morrison over there. The actual sort of printed parts don't have Morrison anywhere. And then they also, of course, used a coloring tool, which is a very important scientific instrument. And so they made these green in certain places as if that was where we were. And actually, we really were. But the map itself was no good at all, because if you just looked at the clan maps, you would probably think Clan Morrison doesn't even exist. It's not really a clan at all. It's probably just one of those patronymics like, I'm going to offend some people, Anderson, for instance, or Simpson, or, wonderful Scottish names. But, of course, there are lots of sons of Andrew in Scotland. It's the patron saint of Scotland, so there are lots of Andersons. But there is no territory that you would find associated with a Clan Anderson, because there isn't a Clan Anderson. So let's go next to the DNA. So the clan map doesn't help us at all. It doesn't suggest that there even is a Clan Morrison. So what does the DNA say? So the DNA, the Clan Morrison, what is he called? He's got some grand title, but let's just call him the boss of the Clan Morrison project on DNA, reported that there have been over 600 Morrisons who've reported in to the program, have supplied their DNA in North America, and these come from 68 distinct genetic groups representing almost every historical county in Scotland. And even within the same areas, there are different lines, different genetic lines that can be found there. So, for instance, some suggest Norse origin, some Pictish, and some from Dalriada, from the old Gaelic homelands. So his tentative conclusion was, it's like Anderson or Simpson. It's a simple patronymic. We must all be descended from some bloke called Morris, but there were lots of different blokes called Morris, and so it's not a clan. So there's the DNA evidence, the clan map evidence, and it's looking a little bleak. So much more important is to go to the telephone book. This gives you some sense of a focus, of an area of concentration. Yes, there are Morrisons within every county, but there are more in some areas than in others. So Morrison is the 18th most common name in Scotland as a whole, and I put up there, but I could have asked you otherwise, what are the two most common names in Scotland? Smith and Brown. Smith and Brown. So, right. Smith and Brown, Mr. McFarland. And then it is the 8th or 9th, because they're roughly the same. Frasers and Morrisons are about the same number in the Highlands and Islands. The two most common names in the Highlands and Islands are, predictably enough, perhaps MacDonald and MacLeod. So it's one of the most common names in the Highlands. Smith, by the way, ranks as number 10 in the Highlands. It's number 1 in Scotland as a whole, but it's only the 10th most common name in the Highlands and Islands. Morrison is more common than Smith. And finally, in the Outer Hebrides, it's the 3rd most common name after, again, MacDonald and MacLeod. So this would suggest a real concentration in one area, not just a universal patronymic. I thought it might be interesting for people of a group of Scots who like to argue about whose clan's more important than somebody else's. But the 25 most common names in the Highlands and Islands divide it sort of conveniently into tiers. And no, not the tiers that are going to be shed by people who find themselves off the list altogether, but tier 1 is MacDonald, MacLeod, Mackenzie, and Mackay, who are the largest clans in the Highlands of Scotland. Tier 2 would be Campbell, MacLean, Ross, Morrison, and Fraser. And then you would fit Smith. And then tier 3 would be Sutherland, Cameron, Stewart, Robertson, Grant, McLennan, Murray, Sinclair, and Monroe. And then tier 4, McKeever or McIver, McRae, McKinnon, McIntosh, and Matheson. These are the most common names, the 25 most common names in the Highlands of Scotland. Wilson would come 26th if it were a clan name. So let's go to the next area of important evidence, which is tradition. The earliest written account of the clan, of the name, was by someone called John Morrison of Bragar in the Isle of Lewis. He's also called the Indweller, and he wrote a history of Lewis. And he claimed, and this was about 1680, he claimed that all Morrisons may challenge descent from the same person, one Morrison, who was the son of a king of Norway. The DNA will show us clearly a very different picture, but that was the tradition. And then the idea was that people came from there and they settled elsewhere. The tradition was, as he reports it, that there were 3 original clans on Lewis: the Morrisons, the Macaulays, and the MacNicolls. And of course, very famously, the MacNicolls' land was taken by the wicked Torquil MacLeod, who, if you don't know that story, I know there is a MacLeod of Lewis in the room, so I won't retell it. There she is. Torquil MacLeod was not a very nice person, not someone you would want to introduce your daughter. Anyway, so the MacLeods ended up taking over Lewis in about 1350, or Torquil MacLeod did, or progressively from 1350 onwards. So his carrying off, what was he called, the violent espousal of the MacNicoll heir and the murder of her family, was around 1350, and the MacLeods ended up taking over most of the island after that. So if there was a period of, if you look at a clan map, the whole of Lewis and frankly the whole of Harris is given to the MacLeods. And that's because it depends on when you put your map, what the dating is. And so if you're looking at the period from let's say it took them 25 years to get control of most of the other island, let's say 1375 up to about 1600, then the MacLeods were the dominant factor in the island of Lewis and Harris. After that, of course, it was the Mackenzies. Before that, it was other people, the Morrisons and the Macaulays and the MacLeods. So clan maps are extremely dangerous and misleading. The Breve, one of the questions that's asked is, was the Breve a real chief? The Breve was the hereditary head of the Morrisons of Lewis, based on a place called Harbust in the Ness district at the north of Lewis. And his authority was supposed to be absolute in the Hebrides. So he was described by a Gordon in the 19th century as having had, he was a kind of judge among the islands who held an absolute judicatory and to whose authority and censure they willingly submit themselves. And there are oral traditions that said that the authority ran from basically the Isle of Man to John O'Groats, so not just in the islands. So putting all that together, the tradition says there really was a clan, and that not just was there a clan, but it was quite a powerful one. So we have some preliminary conclusions about Morrisons, and then we have some general conclusions. The preliminary conclusions about a Clan Morrison are, it is absurd to say it's a patronymic. It can't be just a patronymic. Think about it for a second. Morris, the supposedly Norman name, isn't that common in Scotland compared with, for instance, Andrew, Peter, John, Callum, Fergus, I mean, almost any other name you can think of is more common than Morris. And yet there are more Morrisons than there are any of these other sort of patronymic type of names. There are more Morrisons than all of the McTavishes, Thompsons, and Thompsons put together from all their different origins. There are more Morrisons, far more Morrisons than there are of any of these other groups. The other point is there is a real history of the clan acting as a clan, And this is critical when it comes to trying to identify what a clan might be rather than simply just being a name grouping. So a clan has to have a history of acting together collectively. And if you look at the tourist maps of the Outer Hebrides today, they will show you a place called the Dunrossil, which is a tall standing stone on the northwest of the Isle of Lewis. And it says underneath it on the clan map, on the what is it? It's the Western Isles Tourist Board, effectively, map. It says, site of the last clan battle between the Morrisons and the Macaulays. By the way, I took my children to that, and sort of they had their pictures taken in front of this enormous stone. And then they said, well, that's fine, Dad, but who won the battle? So I said, well, I don't know. So obviously the most important source of evidence on any subject like this is the phone book. Come on, you're not paying attention. It's the phone book. So we went into Ness, and we got hold of the Western Isles phone book, and there were like, I think 2.5 columns of Macaulays and 7 columns of Morrisons. And I said, well, there's your answer. So, you know, obviously the Morrisons won the battle. So Morrison is a very, very common name, and they can't all be related, but it's particularly common in the Hebrides. So it's not only is it a clan because they acted together and fought together, but it's a large one. So there are more Morrisons in Scotland than there are Grahams or Gordons or Douglases or McGregors or Sinclairs or Leslies, and more Morrisons in the Highlands than there are Stuarts, Camerons, Murrays or Macintoshes. So it's a very large clan. It's not on the clan maps because their period of ascendancy was followed by the ascendancy of a different clan, the MacLeods. That's the best we can do on that. So, more general conclusions. Forget about the Morrisons now. There are issues with DNA evidence. Tomorrow, I think we're getting an address by Joe Morrow, the Lord Lion King of Arms, the Reverend Canon Dr. Morrow, Dr. Joseph Morrow, Lord Lion King of Arms. The Lion Court does not use or accept or value DNA evidence. He may mention that, but it's just not something that they choose to get into. They want written documentary evidence. They want documentary proof if they're trying to. What was it? 25% or 20%? Good. It's the good 20%. All right. The DNA evidence is something that just don't want to get into when it comes to, for instance, deciding who really is the chief of something, or who's should inherit a title, or who gets these undifferenced arms, or whatever it might be. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. It's just a complete can of worms, and you can think of some of those. But I put up here an example, which is, has anyone heard of this fellow Torquil Cononach? Maybe our MacLeod lady has heard of him. Do you know who that was? Well, there are lots of Torquils amongst the MacLeods. He was a MacLeod, and he was the presumed heir to the chiefship of the MacLeod of Lewis in about 1570, when a Morrison chief on his deathbed confessed, wanting to save his immortal soul, confessed to being the natural father of the said Torquil Cononach. So Torquil was not, in that sense, a MacLeod. His mother, of course, was a Mackenzie, hence the Cononach, and his natural father was a Morrison. But it's even worse than that, because the Breve, the Morrison of Lewis at the time, his DNA would not have said that he was a Morrison at all anyway, because his, I think, grandmother, great-grandmother, was the heir of the previous chief, and He only had a daughter, that chief, and so she would inherit under Scottish law. And so she married a MacDonald, and so the MacDonald became a Morrison. The MacDonald changed his name to Morrison, and in due course succeeded his father-in-law as the chief, as the breve in Lewis. This has happened a lot in Scotland. Chiefships are passed through a daughter, not just a son. When that happens, they take the grandfather's name, as it were, and then that has to carry on. But the DNA would suggest that they were not of that clan. So Torquil Conanach was not by DNA a MacLeod, and he was not even a Morrison. He would have been a MacDonald, according to his DNA. But of course, that might not have been the case. You go back another few generations, and who knows where that MacDonald might have come from. So DNA is a real issue, and you can't really use it in a very reliable way to indicate that you're a member of one grouping or another. The second thing I want to point out is the value and importance of oral tradition in Scotland, in the Gaelic society particularly, and all Celtic societies, and the value and importance of foundation myths. So a few years ago, some of you may remember there was a case of the MacNeils of Barra, who had always said they were descended from Neil of the Nine Hostages, the famous king of Ireland. And then they did their DNA, and it showed out they were a bunch of bloody Vikings. So, like most of the people in the Outer Hebrides. Does this new evidence, the DNA evidence, how does this affect their picture of themselves? Does it undermine it? Does it destroy it? They have worked to create a culture, a legend, a myth, if you will, about their origins, which gives them a sense of who they are. One of the parallel instances of this, to my mind, would be the case of the children of Israel. So the children of Israel in the Old Testament are described as being literally their ancestors, their eponymous ancestors, which means that every tribe has to have one person who was the supposed original ancestor of that tribe. The 12 tribes that formed the confederation of Hebrew tribes in the Old Testament all claimed to be descended from eponymous ancestors who were brothers, who had the same father, a man called Israel or Jacob. I don't think there are many actual scholars today who think that was historical. I don't think there are a lot of people who would say that there really was a character who had 12 sons and they begat the 12 tribes. But it was a powerful way of bringing 12 different tribes into a nation, into a sense of nation. So the people of Israel, these 12 tribes, became united as a force until, of course, they split again after the death of King David. But they were a real force as 12 tribes. They had an identity because they created a myth, regardless of whether there was any truth in it, which gave them a sense of who they were. And this was the job of Shanachies and bards within Scottish clans. If you want to know more about Shanachies, we have the world's authority sitting in the room with us today, Dr. Bruce Dury, who is the Shanachie for the Dury family, for the chief of the Durys, so Andrew Dury of the chief of the Dury family, but also has produced a Shanachie. Just really means sort of historian, but it means keeper of tradition. It means keeper of the person who can sort of help work out how to install a new chief who can come up with the right form of ceremony for that kind of thing. It's an extremely important role. But the Shenanigans, together with the bards, almost their principal role was to glorify the family of the chief, the ancestors of the clan, and that the result was everybody should try to feel that they were descended from the same eponymous ancestor, regardless of whether they were or not, and they were all bound together and that the chief was their leader. This was the job of the Shenanigans and bards, and I don't want to devalue that. I think it's extremely important in creating an identity. I also like the idea of this concept of a chief of the name and arms, which is a term out of heraldry. So when a clan has been without a chief for a long time, and many of them have been. By the way, there's no such thing as an armigerous clan, but that's the term often used for clans that don't have a chief. Lord Lion wants more and more of them to have a chief, but the goal is they should be a chief of the name and arms. It doesn't say anything about DNA, it doesn't say anything about heredity, but there is only going to be one chief of the name of Morrison, and regardless of whether you're related to him in a DNA sense, if your name is Morrison, he's your chief. So it's a very valuable concept. It skirts over the issue of DNA and genealogy and says identity is about name. Of course, it's not only about name, and so going back to this concept of ko leshu, who do you belong to, that is also the name of a genealogical survey, a genealogical service that is run by someone called Bill Lawson in the Isle of Harris. And if you're of the Outer Hebrides extraction, Bill Lawson will trace your ancestry. He'll do a fabulous job of doing that in many cases. You'll find out even the ship that your ancestors sailed on from the islands. But we know really that we are more than just our surname. There is an interesting tendency amongst Scots in the diaspora to identify with the motherland, with Scotland, through their surname, through their membership in a clan grouping, which is why an organization like COSCA is so important over here. That's not necessarily the way that people look at themselves in Scotland. So if you were to look at someone from the Outer Hebrides, for instance, I think they would identify themselves as a Gael very strongly, and they would feel a great affinity with other Gaels, but they would not see a distinction between a Morrison and a MacLeod or a MacDonald or a Macaulay. They would all be Gaels. National identity matters. Supranational identity matters, not to Mr. Johnson, but it matters to a lot of other people. There are all sorts of different layers of identity, and I think it is invidious sometimes to focus on only one. One of the other issues with identity, of course, I just want to throw out here, because did anyone have to study philosophy in their youth at all? Yes, a few sort of weary hands go up. Well, does anyone remember the problem of identity as a philosophical problem? What about Theseus's ship? Did that ever... there's a nod coming from over there. Okay, well, the idea was that the hero Theseus of Athens went off to Crete and killed the Minotaur and came back. You think I'm going to fall flat on my face, but I wanted an excuse for falling flat on my face, but then it's not attributed to the whiskey consumption. Anyway, Theseus comes back with Princess Ariadne, and he's killed the Minotaur, and he's a real hero. So the people of Athens decide to preserve his ship, and they do. And it's a national monument in Athens. Well, you know, after a while, one of the timbers starts to creak and get a little waterlogged and a little bent, and they have to replace it. And after 200 or 300 years, there isn't a single plank on that ship that was on the original ship of Theseus. So the philosophers like to ask, at what point did that ship cease to be Theseus' ship, or is it still Theseus' ship? And that's a little bit like asking, at what point do you cease to be a Campbell, or are you still a Campbell? I mean, you've got a whole lot of other DNA in you at this point. You've got a whole lot of other elements to who you are. But we like to identify one thing that gives us a sense of identity. And I think that's valid. And so to put it back to the Morrisons, even if you don't share any DNA with the chief of the Morrisons, you are a member of the clan and you're a plank in the ship. The final thing I wanted to mention here I made a brief reference to is there was a lot of fuss not long ago when Senator Warren was under some sort of pressure over her claims for Native American ancestry, and a group of Native American tribal leaders came forward and said, we don't object to her claims so much. You know, if she has 0.05% Native American, whatever it was, she's obviously not Native American. But the people they really objected to claiming tribal membership, tribal identity, were the people who might have 50% tribal identity, tribal blood, but didn't involve themselves in the life of the tribe, in the community. They didn't embrace the values of the community, didn't make any effort to be a part of what a Cherokee might be. And so their point was DNA isn't the story at all. Think when Scotland was doing its Indie Ref 1, because there will be an Indie Ref 2, no doubt. The grounds for being able to vote in that referendum had nothing to do with your bloodlines and your DNA or anything like that. So expatriate Scots like me couldn't get a vote because we were not resident in Scotland. But if you lived in Scotland, you had a vote, regardless of whether you moved there 2 years earlier. So it is arguable that membership in any grouping is a function of the extent to which you make a commitment to that grouping. And it's one of the things that I think separates the people who volunteer their time and make a commitment amongst the diaspora, often far more than you will find back in Scotland. You are all making a commitment to your heritage in a way that is exceptional and is intentional. And that, I think, is what the Native American people were saying that they valued. So with that, I want to congratulate all of you for doing that, to thank you for doing that, and to turn it over for any questions. Oh, no, hold on, John is do we have an opportunity for questions or discussion? Okay. While you're thinking of these questions, I will just tell you. So this very fine whiskey, which I'm consuming very slowly, and Bart Forbes is also consuming over there. is a bowmore, which comes from the island of Islay. And if you look at the barrels on the of bowmore where it is aging in the distillery, they say Morrison's bowmore on them. Bowmore is owned by Suntory of Japan right now. But the barrels still say Morrison's bowmore. The heritage with the Morrisons was extremely short, and there was a Stanley Morrison from Glasgow who went and bought the distillery and owned it for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, and then sold it to the Japanese. So it's not like it's always been that, but it's kind of interesting to relate that to the issue. That's how they still think of themselves, and their email address at the distillery still says Morrison's Bowmore on it. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I have many questions, but one
Ask
that
the experts. They're going to be talking tomorrow. Yep.
One that pops to mind is when you're talking about clan maps and how it's all changed and stuff, there's clan castles all over. Where does that come into this whole picture of where a clan is or isn't?
Well, it's a good question, because you identify these castles with a clan, but in many cases they were occupied by several different clans successively. So one clan might have built it for one purpose, and then another clan would take it over down the road, and half the clans in Scotland ended up being owned by the Campbells. But you know, they may have been built by somebody else. I mean, absolutely not. No, we were very peaceful. It's really pathetic. I'm sorry. There are only two places that are associated in that sort of way with the Morrisons. Morrisons had to keep their head down after 1350. But one is a Jonastian, which is a stack off the north end of Lewis, which by tradition was the place that the Morrisons would run away to when they were attacked by those numerous MacLeods and Macaulays. You know, Glasgow University did an archaeological dig there, and so it sort of mapped out where the perimeter was. But it's not a castle. You go look at it. There's not you know, walls still standing or anything like that. And the other was the Shana Castle on the island of Pabe, which was more closely identified with my family, but for again many of the more recent history, they would have been holding that castle on behalf of the MacLeods. So, no, we were very good at distilling whiskey. The people of Pabe were eventually all, the last inhabitants were evicted from the island of Pabe in the 1840s when a Campbell factor wanted the island for a sheep farm. I'm not bitter or anything like that, but so the last inhabitants were evicted in the 1840s, but the grounds for evicting them was that they were famous for producing the finest whiskey in the area, and it was illegal.
Another question? Second, Ann. We got a microphone right there.
The people who live in the United States and Canada are desperately interested in their DNA and finding out about their hereditary. And I was born in Scotland myself, and living there, we never ever thought about that.
Right.
You know.
Well, you know, and that's true in all sorts of. I mean, one of the things that I think is particularly driving it in the diaspora is that there are so many clan names out here. So many people of Scottish descent can identify through a clan, and that gives them something very strong to link to or to identify with. But the clans are not such a major force in Scotland itself. And if you think about it, in 1750, over half the population of Scotland lived in the Highlands and spoke Gaelic. And today, less than 10% of the population lives in the Highlands, and only 1% speaks Gaelic. So, where are the clans? They're over here. And so the common names in Scotland as a whole, as I say, are Smith and Brown. Those are the two most common names. But there are lots of names that don't give you a sense of a meaningful identity in the same kind of way. They may be professional names, like a Smith, like all kinds of other names. I mean, we've got a hunter here, Ian Hunter. That's a professional name. That's something you did. A Walker is a professional name. And then there are all sorts of other names that are hair colors. So you've got Brown is the second most common name in Scotland. That's a hair color name. You've got grays and blacks and whites. And Reed. Reed means you have red hair. Some clan tried to put Reed down as a sept of their clan. That's absurd. There are more people with red hair in Scotland per head of population than any other country in the world, even than Ireland. So yes, there are lots of people who could be called Reed. So those are the names that you find everywhere. They're professional names, they're place names, they're hair color names. And if you look at the Scottish rugby team, and you can't find 15 more patriotic Scots than the people who will suffer what they suffer for their country on the rugby field, there may be typically two of them who would have a clan name. Maybe there's a Ferguson every now and then, or I don't remember what other names. I think there was one other clan name when I looked a year ago. But generally speaking, well, of course, generally speaking, they're all from the Borders anyway. So, but those are the people who live in Scotland today. The clans all went away, and therefore it's not something that they care about. If you're if your name is Gray or Reed, you're not related to other people called Gray and Reed. It just means that you had ancestors who had gray or red hair. And if you're a Walker, well, there were lots of people who worked the cloth like a Walker. If you're a Dewar, it means that you're a keeper of relics. It doesn't mean that you're related to other people who kept relics. It's just a professional name.
Well, Andrew, I'm going to call up Emma Velasquez.